Well, for those of you who are joining us online or on television, you need to know we are wrapping up this series, Future Family. But if you have missed any of the exciting episodes, you can actually go to futurefamily.org where you can watch all of these messages for free. This is the sixth in a six-part series. And in addition to watching them online, there's a download. You can get some questions. So if you have a small group, or if after watching this series you think, wow, I would really love to watch and talk about that series with our small group, the questions are for free. You just look over there on the right side of your browser and download the questions. Now, today as we wrap this up, I want to try to stretch your thinking and stretch my thinking outside of our current family environment, because when I think about family and when you think about family, we think like Westerners, and we think our immediate family. If I say, tell me about your family, you tell me about whether or not you were married, you might talk about your brothers and sisters and your kids, and you would stop right there. But in many parts of the world, if you said, tell me about your family, they would tell you about their great-grandfather and their grandfather, and then their father, and then perhaps their kids, and then they would talk about the future. But unfortunately, in our Western way of thinking, family is all about right now. But here's something that you know, that you are who you are today because of your parents, but your parents are who they are or who they were because of their parents and their grandparents. And chances are, because you're a father or a mother or an uncle or an aunt, you are going to influence not only your kids or your nieces and nephews, but you'll have influence in the generation after that. And that we are who we are because of the people that came along before us. And we are in the process, whether we're intentional about it or not, whether we give any thought to it or not, we are a part of shaping the next generation of our family by what we say and by what we do. Now, I bet if you spend a few minutes thinking about it, just about everybody listening or watching online or on television or in the auditoriums with me could think of someone or think of a story in their past where a grandparent, because you probably knew one or more of your grandparents, or perhaps you have a snapshot of a great-grandparent, but there's a story about your great-grandparent that influenced your grandparents, that influenced your parents, and to some degree, you can even begin to understand why you are who you are today because of a previous generation. Now, this is the part we don't think about. You are somebody's previous generation. Think about that. You're going to be a snapshot in somebody's mind someday. Oh yeah, I had a great aunt. I kind of remember her, when I was a little girl. It'll be you. I had a great uncle. I had a great grandfather. Oh yeah, he was the smelly guy that, we kind of rolled around, and it's you. And your decisions now and what you're doing now are going to impact that next generation. Now, this is a big deal to me because of the story I'm going to tell you. But as I mentioned last week, my father's father died when my father was a baby. He was 17 months old. And so he never knew his father. But as he got older, he got connected with his grandfather. And his grandfather was, what do you know, a pastor in Virginia. And he preached at several little churches and kind of moved around and took care of several congregations and preached as an itinerant evangelist. And my father grew up hearing my grandfather tell these amazing stories of being a pastor and preaching and God's faithfulness. And it severely impacted my dad, and my dad went to ministry. I'm in ministry today. I'm doing this today because of my great-grandfather's influence on my father, who then influenced me. I bet you have your own story. Now, my great-grandfather, who I didn't know, obviously, he had some amazing stories, so I'm just going to tell you one because it kind of ties into where we're going today. And again, my father would go visit him in the summers, and one of the stories he told him that my father told me that I'll never forget, in fact, after I tell you, you'll never forget either. He said one afternoon he was preaching at a little tiny church in a little town outside of Danville, Virginia, and while he was preaching at this little church, these two guys came in and sat on the back row, and they started talking loud. And they kept interrupting the service, and he kept asking them to be quiet, and they wouldn't be quiet, and it turned out later he found out they were drunk. And so he kept trying to get these two drunk guys to be quiet during the service, and eventually he threw them out of church. Now, we don't know if he physically went back there and did it or had the deacons do it or, but he threw these guys out of church. Well, after the service, one of the deacons came down and said, Reverend Stanley, those two guys that you threw out of the service, they are waiting on you outside the door, and they both have a kitchen butcher knife. That's a quote from my dad from the story as his grandfather told him. And the deacon said, Pastor Stanley, Reverend Stanley, should I call the police? And according to the story, my great-grandfather said, no, you just make sure everyone gets out safely, and I'll handle this. Well, I'm like an 8-year-old boy. Like, are you kidding? This is wow, And so, as the story goes, as my great-grandfather told my father, he said, after everyone left, I knelt down at the altar and I said, God, you called me into ministry. And I tell people all the time they can trust you and that they don't need to be afraid. And so I'm going to trust you today. And then he got his big old brown Schofield Bible that my father still has, and he walked to the door of the church and he stood right there and he looked at each of those men in the eye And he walked right between them, and as the story goes, and he could smell the alcohol on their breath. And he walked right down the stairs, and he walked home, and they never moved like the lions in Daniel, and the lions in the story of Daniel and the lions, and they never moved. Then later that afternoon, now this is kind of the freaky part, okay, but I got to tell you the whole story. Later that afternoon, my great-grandfather's having lunch, and they hear sirens in the town, and they discover later that these two men, because they were drunk, wrecked their car into a transformer, and it blew up and burned the car up, and you could hear them screaming as they burned to death. And of course, as an 8-year-old, you're like, oh my gosh, wow, yeah. So you'll never forget that story, right? And neither did my father, and neither will I. And then after my great-grandfather would tell my dad these kinds of stories just about these kind of freaky things that, God did on his behalf, he would make a statement that stayed with my dad throughout his life, and it stayed with me throughout my life because my dad passed it along to me from my great-grandfather. And here's the statement. He would say, Charles, if God tells you to run your head through a brick wall, you start running and trust God to make a hole. Now that's good advice, isn't it? If God tells you to run your head through a brick wall, you start running. You don't wait around for it to see how it's going to work out, and you just trust God to make a hole. And I think those who know my dad would say that pretty much summarizes the way that he did ministry all these years. If God said jump, he said how high. When God said go, he just went. If God tells you to run your head through a brick wall. So I grew up hearing the stories from my great-grandfather about God's faithfulness and God's provision and God's protection. So consequently, a generation I never knew greatly influenced this generation as I now try to influence my generation and my kids as they discover who God is and how God can be trusted. Now here's my point. That's kind of a big dramatic story. But you are who you are because of the family that came before you, and the family that comes after you, kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews, grandnieces, grandnephews, they will be who they are in large part based on your influence. You have a future family, and you are currently in the process of making your mark on that future family. Now, this is the best illustration of this I know actually comes from the scriptures. And I told you when we started this series that the problem with this whole series is there aren't any great examples of family in the Bible. I mean, if you want to read about dysfunctional family, read the Old Testament, okay? It is so dysfunctional, it's why I don't like to use the term biblical family. And people say, well, I want to have a biblical family. I'm like, I don't think so. Which one? Because there's some really funky ones in there, okay? Let's talk about New Testament, Christian family. Don't leave it open to biblical family. You will get into all, that's way open to interpretation. But there is one story that is so remarkable. The problem with the story and the reason you probably have never heard the story I'm about to tell the way I'm about to tell it is because it covers 60 years. It covers about 2/3 or a little more than half the entire book of Genesis. And the second half of the story you're familiar with. And the second half of the story is somewhat miraculous, but the second half of the story doesn't make complete sense until you understand the first half of the story. But it illustrates the power of generational parenting, and it illustrates the power of thinking in terms, what kind of legacy am I leaving for the next generation? So I want to tell you the part you know, and then I want to go back and tell you the part that maybe you've never connected the dots with. If you're not a church person, all of this may be new. I'm going to cover it quickly, but I would dare you, even if you don't believe the Bible, even if you have to buy a Bible, I would dare you to find the Bible, turn to the book of Genesis, skip all that creation part you don't believe anyway, that's okay, and turn to the part I'm about to tell you because this will keep you up at night. It's so incredibly exciting. Now, this story of family begins with the most famous family in all the world, a family that just about everybody in every part of the world has heard of or knows about. It begins with the family of Abraham, who had a couple of sons, and one of his sons was Isaac. And Isaac had two sons known as Jacob and Esau, if you grew up in church, but actually it was Esau and Jacob because they were twins. And Esau came out first, he was born first, and so he was considered the firstborn. And as the oldest, he had some extraordinary opportunities because as the older son in that culture, it meant that you got a double share of all the inheritance compared to all your brothers and sisters. And it also meant that you were the judge of your family. You were the authority, so that when dad died, you were actually the rule maker, the power broker for the entire clan. Now, Jacob had 12 sons, and his most famous son was, in fact, Joseph. And this is the story that so many of us grew up hearing. That's such a powerful story. And so I'm going to tell it to you real quickly. When Joseph was about 17 years old, he discovered very quickly that his brothers, and all of them had been born except the youngest son, Benjamin, who wasn't born yet, all of these sons, all of his brothers pretty much hated him. And the reason they hated him, and here's that whole biblical family problem, the reason they hated him is because Joseph was the son of his father's favorite wife. Now there's something, right? Honey, you're my favorite wife. Oh, thank you. You're my second favorite wife, and you're my third, and your kids aren't my favorite because you're not. So it got really weird. So biblical marriage, interesting. Okay, so Joseph is the son of Jacob and came from Jacob's favorite wife. Now, all these other kids we'll get to in just a minute, but Joseph was the favorite. So one day, Jacob says to Joseph, I want you to go check on your brothers because they're always up to no good, and I want you to check on them. And generally speaking, Joseph would come back to Jacob and say, Dad, you're not going to believe what they're doing. So on this particular occasion, you've heard this story probably. The brothers, 10 of the brothers are all out there, doing their thing. Joseph goes to where they're supposed to be. They're not there. He finds out where they are, and he goes to where they actually are, and they see him coming, and they're like, here comes that dreamer. Here comes the rat. Here comes, the narc. Here comes the guy that's just going to go back to Dad and say, Dad, they're doing it again. Whatever it is they would do to get in trouble. So they decided they'd had enough, and they decided, let's just kill him. Let's just be done with this once and for all. So when Joseph gets there, all smiles, they take him, strip his robe off of him, and they throw him in an empty well to decide what to do with him. And then they're overwhelmed by mercy, and they decide, let's don't kill him. Let's just sell him and tell our parents he was killed. That's even better. They think he's dead. We make a few, a little bit of change on the side. And so sure enough, they sell him to some slave traders. They break their father's heart. They go back and say, Jacob, what can we say, Father Jacob? We found his robe, and there was blood on it, blood of an animal, and his blood mixed in, and it looks like it was a terrible fight, and I'm sure he did a good job, but your favorite son from your favorite wife is dead. And they sell their brother into slavery, and he's on his way to Egypt. Now, when you read Bible stories, when we hear ancient stories, we all tend to romanticize them because we can't smell it, we can't see it, we can't even comprehend it. But here's a 17-year-old boy who is shackled behind probably camels, dragged across the desert. He has grown up with slaves. He knows what the life of a slave can be like. And he knows life as he has known it is over. He's not sure he will ever make it to Egypt. And he has no idea who he will be sold to and what he will spend the rest of his life doing. And he also knows something that we forget, that in ancient times, it was practically impossible to commit suicide. It was very difficult to kill yourself. You could injure yourself, but it was very difficult to take one's own life. And so this was the life ahead of him. He makes it somehow safely to Egypt, and he's sold to a man named Potiphar, who actually was one of the captains in the army and the guard of Pharaoh. So a very powerful man. So he lucked out there. And when he went into Potiphar's house, we discover something interesting about Joseph. That Joseph decided to live his life as if God was with him when it seemed like God had abandoned him. At every turn, we find Joseph doing the right thing, even though right things never happen. He continues to live as one that God is with, even though fate seems to take him in the strangest places. And he began to gain favor in the eyes of his master Potiphar, but he also attracted attention from Potiphar's wife. And Potiphar's wife came to Joseph and said, I would like you to be my boy. I want you to be my guy. And Joseph said, no, I can't do that. It would dishonor my master, your husband. He says, it's kind of funny. It would dishonor my master, your husband. You're married. Hello. And it would also dishonor, now get this, my God. To which we would say, time out, Joseph. Which God is that? The God that allowed your brothers to sell you instead of killing you? The brothers that stole your life from you? The God who had watched that whole scene and did nothing to protect you? And Joseph decided to do the right thing. And so Potiphar's wife frames him and claims that this Hebrew boy that they brought into their family tried to rape her, and they had no choice but to listen to her accusation. And then the slave is thrown in the dungeon. Now, it's bad to be in the dungeon. It's bad to be a slave. It's really, really bad to be a slave in the dungeon because you're not waiting for a court date. You're not waiting for a court-appointed attorney to show up at your cell. You're just waiting forever. And yet, Joseph continues to live like a man that God was with, even as though it seemed like God had abandoned him. He continued to do the right thing, even though the right things never seemed to happen in his favor. And then we run into this very strange verse in the book of Genesis that summarizes this stage of Joseph's life. And here's what it says. It says, the Lord was with him, Joseph, which is good. That's good. He showed him kindness. That's good. And he granted him favor. That's good. In the eyes of the prison warden. Now look, if God is with you, you do not have a personal relationship with the prison warden. If God is with you, you don't really care what the prison warden thinks because you don't want to know the prison warden. And there's sort of there's this tension of, the good news is, Joseph, I'm with you. Yeah, but we're in the prison. I don't want to have favor with the prison warden. That means every once in a while he throws me another half a loaf of bread. Big deal. This isn't evidence that God is with me. This isn't evidence that I've been favored by God, that God is being kind. And yet Joseph continues to do what anyone would do who believed God was with him, even though it seemed that God had abandoned him. Where did that come from? Where did he get that kind of faith? Well, time goes on, and eventually Pharaoh gets mad at a couple of his posse, and he throws them in this dungeon as well, and they meet Joseph. And Joseph interprets their dream. And one of the dreams is by the cupbearer, and he says to the cupbearer, to Pharaoh, he says, look, you're going to be restored to Pharaoh. This is what your dream means. And the guy says, that's amazing. He says, now look, when you're restored, do me a favor. Would you tell somebody I'm here? Nobody knows I'm here. I've been here for years. I'm going to die in this dungeon. First of all, my brothers betrayed me. I don't even need to be here. You can tell by my accent. I am not from here, okay? Secondly, then, Potiphar's wife accuses me. I do not need to be here. So when you get out, and the cupbearer says, look, if what you have predicted comes true, of course I'm going to tell somebody. And sure enough, what he predicted came true. The cupbearer was restored to Pharaoh's service, and Genesis tells us that he forgot all about Joseph. And for 2 more years, every day he wakes up to the same thing over and over and over. And his only consolation is, the warden likes me, the warden likes me, the warden likes me. 2 years later, Pharaoh has a dream. And nobody can interpret the dream. And Pharaoh knows this is an important dream that needs an interpretation. And suddenly the cupbearer comes to his senses and it's like, oh yeah. And he says, sir, pardon me, but you remember a couple years ago we had that thing? Let's not go into that. Anyway, I ended up in the dungeon, which I deserve. But while I was there, I met a boy. And I had a dream, and this boy predicted that I would be restored to your service. And sure enough, here I am. Perhaps he can interpret your dream, oh great one. Next thing you know, they're down in the dungeon trying to, go through the roster. Is there a Hebrew boy named Joseph here? And Joseph raises his hand. He has no idea what's going to happen. They bring him out. They shower him. They shave him. They cut his hair. They pierce his ear. They probably give him a couple tattoos. By the time it's over with, he looks like he actually belongs in that culture. And they bring him into the palace. And they bring him into the throne room. And he is before the most powerful man in all the world, the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh says from his giant throne, he says, young man, I've heard that the gods are with you and that you can interpret dreams. And then Joseph says the dumbest thing imaginable. He says, no, he says, I can't. But my God may be able to give Pharaoh an interpretation of his dream. And everyone in the courtroom gasped that he would talk to a man who is viewed as a god in such a way. And Joseph's words communicated, there is one great God, Pharaoh, to whom you are accountable. And the palace guards reach for their swords. And Pharaoh stops him. He says, I need to know the interpretation of this dream. And he tells him the dream. And Joseph says, it's easy. Well, he didn't say it's easy. He said, got it. He says, here's what your dream means. For the next 7 years, Egypt is going to have such a bountiful harvest, you're not going to know what to do with all the grain that you produce. The following 7 years, there's going to be a famine, and it's going to destroy and perhaps wreck the economy of this great nation and the entire surrounding area. So you're going to have 7 years of plenty, and then you're going to have 7 years of famine. And then Joseph does the unthinkable. He doesn't stop with the interpretation. He begins to give Pharaoh advice. Now, I realize I'm not from here. I realize you just brought me out of prison. You can probably still smell jail, but let me give you some advice. Oh, great Pharaoh. Here's what you need to do. You need to find a really, really strong administrator. You need to put him in charge of a project. You need to build grain silos in every single major city in the nation, and you need to tax the people 20% of all their grain. Just take it as a government, put it in the grain silos, and save it for 7 years. And then what's going to happen, your people are going to run out of grain, and then you, Pharaoh, are going to be able to sell the grain back to the people. It's going to make you incredibly, incredibly wealthy. Eventually, people from the surrounding areas are going to find out you're the only guy with grain in town. You are going to be so wealthy by the time this thing is over, it's going to be unbelievable. But you got to find somebody really sharp. They got to wake up every single day thinking about this project because you only got 7 years. And all the scribes going, this is a great idea. Pharaoh says, what do y'all think about that? No, that's a great idea. Pharaoh says to Joseph, putting you in charge. And everybody in the courtroom gasps, wait a minute. We've known this guy all of 15 minutes. He's not even from here. Pharaoh says, can we find a greater, wiser man in all of my kingdom? And on that day, Joseph becomes the prime minister of Egypt, the second in command. So he goes to work and he does his job. And sure enough, there's so much grain. The crops are so bountiful in that area. They can't even eat it all. They can barely save it all. And he goes all around the countryside building these silos and filling them full of grain. Then on January the 1st, the beginning of the 8th year, it all comes to an end. Nobody can grow anything. And the people begin to starve. And Joseph, who's in charge of saving all of this grain, he begins to distribute grain to the people of Egypt. And finally, word gets outside of Egypt that there is food in Egypt. And people from all over the region begin to pour into Egypt to buy grain from the Egyptians. And 2 years into the famine, the family of Joseph has run out of food. And they have no choice but to go to Egypt to buy food. You should read your Bible. Now, here's what happens, okay? So Israel, Jacob's sons, remember Jacob is Joseph's father. By this time, God has changed his name to Israel. That's where Israel came from. Interesting Bible fact. So Jacob's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. And as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. Now he's 39 years old. It's been 22 years since he last saw his brothers. And there they are. And not only there they are in a row, bowed down to him. And he remembers. He remembers their voices as he stood in the bottom of that cistern. He remembers the terror of a 17-year-old brother with 10 older brothers having his fate in their hands. He remembers the smiles and the laughs as they sold him. He remembers the clink of the silver as they were paid. He remembers the laughing. He remembers the drunkenness. He remembers the total lack of concern on that day when, for all practical purposes, he was a dead man. And he remembers all the years sitting in the dungeon, knowing that this was the end. He didn't know the end of his story. He didn't have an Old Testament. He didn't know that we would be talking about him over, 4,000 or 5,000 years later. He had no idea. And there they are, bowed down in front of their brother, and their fate, their destiny is in his hands. But he also remembered something else, a scene from his childhood. And Joseph connected the dots. And here's the part of the story that never gets connected. So now we've got to rewind and go back many, many, many years. Remember, there's Abraham, there's Isaac, and there's Esau and Jacob. When Esau and Jacob were teenagers, maybe middle school age, maybe, high school age, when Jacob and Esau were teenagers, they were twin brothers, but they were very, very different. Esau was a woodsman. He loved to hunt and fish. Jacob was an extraordinary cook. He just had different skills. And one day, Genesis tells us that when Esau was a teenager and Jacob was a teenager, Esau had been out hunting for several days and he had nothing to show for it. And he was starving to death. And he comes home and he smells something that smells so good. And he walks in the kitchen and there's Jacob in there stirring a pot of stew. And Esau says, oh, Jacob, I got to have some stew. Give me your stew or I'm going to die. Now, this is a rare moment for a younger brother, because younger brothers never have an opportunity to leverage anything when it comes to older brothers. Older brothers never need anything from younger brothers, but in this moment, suddenly the older needs something from the younger, and Jacob, the smart younger brother, does what every younger brother does in this situation. He says, okay, what can I get out of this? Let's start the bidding as high as possible and see what we work our way down to. So probably as an afterthought, as he stirs this stew, he says, okay, let's make a trade. I'll trade you a bowl of stew for your birthright. Birthright. The birthright, as I said, meant that he would inherit over half of everything from his very wealthy father. Birthright meant that he would have possibly 2 or 3 or 4 times as much wealth as his older brother. And Esau, it's a teenager, frontal lobe, not completely developed yet, okay? Very, very, very hungry. It's all about now. It's all about now. It's all about now. And he says, deal. And he trades his birthright for a bowl of stew. And the Bible tells us on that day he despised his birthright. And he ate his stew, and the stew was gone, but so was the most valuable thing he had as an older brother. A little time goes by. We don't know if it was days or perhaps weeks. And their father, Isaac, is very, very old. And he begins to lose his eyesight. And it's time now for the brothers to go before Isaac, all the children actually, to go before Isaac for a blessing. And a blessing was a legally binding ceremony. Whatever the father said, it was legally binding in those days. And part of the blessing for the older brother was that Isaac would lay his hands on his older son Esau, and he would bestow upon him the power of judge over all the family. That whoever blesses you will be blessed, whoever curses you will be cursed, and you will lord it over your family. You are now taking my place as the patriarch over this entire clan. And Jacob, with the help of his mother, sneaks in before Esau into a dark room, and he covers his arms with fur so that he'll feel like his brother Esau. And he sneaks in, and he lowers his voice, and he says, I am Esau, and I've come for the blessing. And his father, Isaac, is confused and says, you don't sound like Esau. And Jacob swears. He says, no, I'm Esau, your eldest. And his father lays his hands on him, and he gives him the blessing. He gives them the authority and the power of the firstborn. And he leaves. And soon after that, Esau comes in for the blessing. And his father's confused, and he says, I'm sorry, I've already given the blessing. I can only give it once. And I gave it to the one who was here before you. And now Esau is angry with his brother. He has stolen everything that was rightfully his, and there's nothing he can do about it. Genesis tells us this: Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. And he said to himself, the days of mourning, talking about the fact that his father was about to die, the days of mourning for my father are near then. I will kill my brother Jacob. As soon as my father dies, I'm going to kill my brother Jacob. And when I kill my brother Jacob, the birthright is mine again. And when I kill my brother Jacob, the blessing is mine again. And I will not bow down to my younger brother. Word gets to Jacob, it's not going well. You have until your father dies to disappear, or you will join him in the next life. And so Jacob runs for his life. He leaves that area, he leaves that country, and he goes to live with one of his uncles. And his uncle has 2 daughters, and he's away for over 20 years, just a little over 20 years. And during that time, Jacob marries Leah, and then he marries Rachel, and Leah's the younger sister, and Rachel's the older sister, and Rachel would become his, favorite wife. We've already covered that. And so Leah starts having kids. She has a boy, there's a second boy, a third boy, a fourth boy. Rachel, she can't get pregnant. There's all this stuff. So she says, here, take my maidservant, and if she has a baby, it'll be my baby. So next thing you know, every time he comes home, you should read this. Every time he comes home, there's a different woman waiting for him. We got to have a child. It's like, whatever. So by the time it's over, he's got 4 women and he's got 11 sons over the course of about 20 years. You should read it for yourself, okay? So this happens for 20 years. And not only that, he becomes extraordinarily wealthy. He becomes so wealthy, his herds become so large. All of his herds are so large, he can't even stay in the area. He can't even feed his herds. And the other people in that region, his uncle's family, are saying, there's too many of you people and there's too many herds. You've got to go somewhere else. And so after 20 years, God speaks, and it says, then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers. That would be Abraham, Isaac, and Esau. Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. To which, no doubt, Jacob thought, you had better be with me. Because if Esau is the same Esau I left 20-something years ago, not only will he kill me, he's going to kill all of my sons, and he's going to take my wives as his wives. Not only is he going to kill me and all 11 of my sons, he's also going to take all of my property. And when he sees the wealth that I am bringing to him, it will be more than he can bear, and he will think to himself, at last, God has vindicated me because my silly brother Jacob is actually bringing back to me the wealth that he stole from me when we were kids. And you see, these were stories that his wives understood. These were stories that his kids understood. We're going back to see Uncle Esau? Yes. Isn't that dangerous? Yes. We're going to meet Uncle Esau, but isn't Uncle Esau the one that Daddy told us about when he told us the story? Yeah, that's the same Uncle Esau. So he packs up his family and all of his herds and all of his slaves and both of his wives and all 11 of his children, and they begin to make the long journey back to the land of his fathers. And Esau hears that they're coming. And here's how the story continues. Jacob looked up, and there was Esau coming with his 400 men. Not 400 people, not 400, and I brought my wives and kids so we can all meet the cousins. 400 men, a small army. So Jacob knows what's about to happen, and it's too late to do anything about it. So he divided the children among Leah, that's his first wife, Rachel's younger sister, and Rachel, have I mentioned, his favorite wife, and the two female servants that these two women threw at him to keep having children. So he divided up between them, and he put the female servant and their children in front, Leah, second favorite wife, and her children next. Now, when I read this years and years ago, it just floored me. I just had to stop. And Rachel and Joseph in the rear. Joseph is the only of the 11 sons mentioned by name. And he put Joseph and Rachel in the rear. Now we're about to find out in the rear doesn't mean miles away. In the rear just means at the end of this little wagon train, caravan, so everybody can see what's happening. And then he himself, look at this, he himself went on ahead and he bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. So get the picture. Here's his brother Esau on the ridge with 400 mounted men to his left and his right. And here comes a poorly guarded caravan with so much wealth, it is an irresistible target for anyone. And here comes Esau, and here comes Jacob. He steps out in front of his wives and his children, and he begins to make his way across no man's land toward his brother Esau. And every few steps he falls and he bows down to his brother. And he takes a few more steps and he bows down to his brother over and over. And the family, the children, the wives, the slaves, the servants, they watch because their destiny is in the hands of a man they do not know and that their master hasn't seen in over 20 years. And as he gets close to Esau, the writer of Genesis says that Esau ran to meet Jacob. And he embraced him, and he threw his arms around his neck, and he kissed him, and they wept. And then, because it was right there, then Esau looked up and he saw the women and children. "Who are these with you?" he asked. And Jacob answered, "They are the children God has graciously given to your servant." And then the female servants and their children approached, and they bowed down to Uncle Esau. Next, Leah and her children came, and they bowed down to Uncle Esau. And last of all, there it is again, the only name mentioned, came Joseph and Rachel, and they too bowed down. This was a story Joseph had heard all of his life. The day that Uncle Esau spared your father's life, and Joseph, he spared your life, and he spared your mother's life. And Joseph, you know the story. your father deserved, anything Uncle Esau chose. But on that day, there was a reconciliation that no one expected, that no one deserved. And Joseph, it's why you're alive today. And now, 30-something years later, there stands Joseph with his own brothers, arrayed before him with their face to the ground. And he's got the power of life and death in his hands. And he chooses to do for them what he saw his uncle do for him. And he chooses in a moment of crisis, and he chooses in a moment of extraordinary emotion, extraordinarily conflicting emotions. He chooses to do what he saw done for him. He chooses to do what the story he grew up hearing was all about. And he extended mercy to brothers who deserved no mercy. The story continues. You should read it for yourself. Eventually, he lets them know, I may walk like an Egyptian and I may talk like an Egyptian, but I'm a Hebrew and I'm your brother, baby. And they looked up and, oh my gosh, through all that makeup and through all the garb, they saw, it is our 17-year-old brother. And they were scared to death. And there's a part of the story is that Joseph gathers them in his arms and they all weep together. And he says, you may have intended this for evil, but God has intended this for good. And he restored the relationship, and he provided for his family. And even after his father died, when they assumed he would extract his revenge, he said, no, this is for your good. This is the thing my God would have me do. And the moral of the story is this. What your children and what your grandchildren and what your nieces and what your nephews see you do will lay the groundwork for what they do in times of crisis. They will forget just about everything we say. They will never forget who we are, what we are, and they will never forget what we did when doing the right thing was difficult, when staying was difficult, when running away would have been the easier thing, when not paying our debts would have been the easier thing, when mishandling our money would be the easier thing to do. They won't remember what we say, but they will remember who we are and they will remember what we do. So dad, think about it, dads, grandfathers. What if what you do is the thing that your son, your sons, your grandsons take their cue from? What if the thing that you do, what if it's you that they look to as their pattern? What dads, what if you are the role model for how they treat your future daughter-in-law or daughters-in-law? What if you're the model for how they raise your grandchildren? What if you're the model for how they deal with really extraordinary temptation? What if you're the model for how they respond to crisis in life? What if they take their cue from you? Odds are, they will. Mom, what if your daughters decide to take their cue from you about how they treat, talk to, and respond to your future son-in-law or sons-in-law? What if they take their cue from you in terms of how they raise your grandchildren? What if they take their cue from you from how you view money, your worldview, how you respond to the call of God, how you respond to the whole issue of spirituality? What if they take their cue? What if you are now determining what your future family, the next generation, does? Chances are you are. And most of us won't be around to see the full implications of our decisions. But rest assured, decisions will be made with the imprint of your life in mind. Bottom line, actions, they don't merely speak louder than words. Sometimes they echo into the next generation. Your actions, of course, they speak louder than words, but it's not just about here and now. It's not just about the next 10 or 15 years. Actions speak louder than words, but you're going to have some actions. You're going to do some things that will echo into the next generation of your future family. So the question for me as a father, who maybe, hopefully by God's grace, will one day be a grandfather, who by God's grace may be a great grandfather that my great grandchildren never remember. What will echo from my life into that next generation? And what will echo from your life into the next generation? Because, yeah, your actions speak louder than words, but it's bigger than that. It's broader than that. It's more powerful than that. It means you have a greater opportunity than perhaps you ever imagined. Because you can make decisions now. You can respond to temptation now. You can manage your money now. You can respond to relational crisis now in such a way that it will reverberate into your future family. If this is true, then what should you do? If this is true, what should you do differently? If this is true, then what do we need to change? And if this is true, why wouldn't we change? And why wouldn't we change as soon as possible? Let's pray. Father, that's just a daunting thought. And it's so big. And Father, for the singles in our church, they're still looking for that first relationship. They're not thinking about the next generation. I pray that you would just drive this truth into their hearts as they even think about who they want to spend the rest of their life with. Father, for those in our churches with little kids, and it's all they can do to get to the end of the day. They love nap time and they love bedtime, and that's about as far as they can think. Father, just give them a vision for what's to come. Father, for every struggling marriage that's hanging by a thread, for the man and the woman who keep telling themselves, oh, for the sake of the kids, we should divorce. Oh, for the sake of the kids, we should split up. Oh, for the sake of the kids. I pray they would rethink that. And they would think beyond their own personal happiness. They would think beyond the next 10 or 15 years. And they would ask the question, yeah, but what reverberates to the next generation? When my kids tell their story, what are they going to say about me? What role do I have in their story? Father, just plaster this across every facet of our lives. And that we wouldn't be so selfish as to think it's just about as far as I can see. But Father, I pray that our story, as it is told in the generations to come, would be a story that's worth telling. That people would be grateful. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren would be grateful for the tough decisions we made, the way we made them, the way we lived out our faith. And Father, we all confess this is hard to remember, but I pray that we would remember. And I pray that the echo we send to the next generation would be powerful and that it would honor you. And we pray all of these things in the amazing name of Jesus, whose death has echoed all the way into our lives. Amen.